What's up, everybody? My name is Adam McDorman, and this is American Literature. Now, this week we're going to be reading our first piece of short fiction for the year. We're going to be looking at Rip Van Winkle by Washington Irving. Now, as always, the best way for us to get the most out of this text will be to know a little bit about the author himself, to have some sense of the historical context that surrounds our reading, to look at a few key literary features of this text, and as always, we'll finish by looking at a few big ideas that we'll use as a frame through which to view this particular text. Washington Irving lived from 1783 to 1859. Now, usually that's a bit of information that we sail by pretty quickly on our way to more important historical and biographical details, but it's important for us to pause here and take note of the fact that he was born after the American Revolution. Okay, that's kind of a key delineator in the text that we've been reading thus far. Everything that we've looked at has been leading up to America as an independent nation. The Irving family were merchants in New York City. That means that they were a family of means. They were a part of the upper class society in Manhattan, which is a borough in New York City. And Washington Irving himself was actually born the very same week that news broke that the fighting between the American colonies and Great Britain had ceased and the American Revolutionary War was over. And as a result, Washington Irving was actually named after George Washington. Washington Irving was not a particularly good student. He was far more interested in stories than in school. He spent a lot of time learning local folklore and ghost stories that he would hear in neighboring cities and towns. And that played into what he would eventually become as a writer. Speaking of which, in his early years as a writer, he experienced really not a whole lot of success. And that forced him to be pretty reliant on financial support from his wealthy family members. However, the War of 1812 really wrecked his family's business. Now, Washington Irving himself briefly served in the War of 1812, but he didn't really see much action. After the war was over, many American merchants, his family included, were in a really tough spot financially. So Washington Irving went to Europe to try to get more business, but after a few years, they just had to declare bankruptcy. However, keep in mind that one of his primary interests was local legend and folklore. Now, while he's traveling through Europe for several years trying to drum up business for his family, he's collecting bits and pieces of local folklore from different countries in Europe, and that's going to go on to inspire some of his most well-known stories, including the one that you'll read this week and the one you'll read next week as well. And this leads up to Washington Irving's first major success as an author. But to understand how he gets there, we have to kind of take a couple of steps back. Before the War of 1812, Washington Irving engaged in probably what was a very early example of viral marketing. Around 1809 or so, Washington Irving spread this hoax that a famous Dutch historian named Deirdre Knickerbocker had just vanished from a local inn and left behind a manuscript for a history of New York. And he had said that if Deirdre Knickerbocker never returned back to get his manuscript, that he would go on and publish it himself. And this mysterious persona that he had created turned out to be a big hit. The locals were very interested in the mystery of this Deirdre Knickerbocker character. So when the book actually came out, it was a hit in that area. Fast forward to his time in Europe while he's going around and trying to save his family's business. Remember, he's collecting bits and pieces of local folklore, and he writes a collection of short stories under the Knickerbocker pseudonym. Included in this collection of short stories is Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, both of which are very well-known stories. Even if you have never heard of Washington Irving, you're probably at least somewhat familiar with both of these stories. That collection of stories makes Washington Irving an international hit. So he goes from being a local success in New York to a global one. One of the defining features of this Deirdre Knickerbocker character was his baggy knee trousers, which went on to be called knickerbockers, or knickers, if you will. And that term goes on to be used to refer to people who live in the Manhattan borough of New York City. And eventually we end up with a sports ball team called the New York Knickerbockers, or the New York Knicks. So let's take a look at a few key literary features of Rip Van Winkle. Unlike anything that we've read thus far, we are finally looking at a work of short fiction, or a short story. You could put this short story into a couple of different genres. You could call it folklore, and the term folklore, for our purposes at least, refers to a story that has its roots in a distinct cultural tradition. And you'll see that in Rip Van Winkle and its many references to the Dutch in the local area. You could call it a fairy tale, which is a type of folklore story that involves magical creatures or enchantments. And of course, as you read this story, it will be very apparent that there is magic of some kind involved. And lastly, you could call it a tall tale or perhaps a legend, which is an unbelievable story that is presented as though it is factually accurate. Some of these types of stories contain within them some type of moral warning for the reader. And that's a thing that you might want to keep an eye out for as you read this text. Rip Van Winkle may be a very early example of American literary romanticism, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means next week, but it is a feature of this text as well. Also, we want to take note of the fact that Washington Irving originally published this story under a pseudonym, which is just a fictitious name used in place of the author's real name on a published work. And we have to ask ourselves, why would he decide to do that? Why would he publish these stories under the name Deirdre Knickerbocker instead of Washington Irving? And the last literary feature that I want to point out to you about this text is its use of a very particular character archetype. Now, a character archetype is basically a template for a character that is so universal in storytelling that it can be used in different stories across cultures. Now, some modern-day examples of this particular character archetype would include Captain America, Buck Rogers, who you might have to ask your grandparents about, I guess, and also the nameless Vault Dweller from the video game Fallout 4. And of course, we can't forget Philip J. Fry from Futurama. I want you to think about for a second what these characters have in common with one another. They are examples of what I would call the man out of time character archetype. Now, the man or woman out of time is a character who, for some reason, could be scientific, could be magical, falls asleep, or is put into stasis for a very, very long time. And they end up waking up in a version of the world that they no longer recognize. They're a person out of time. They are in a different time. And we'll finish by looking at the big ideas that this text touches on. Now, the first one's kind of a minor one, and that's that, again, the common man doesn't really care about the American Revolution. There's a minor detail in this story about a portrait of King George III that hangs on the wall in a local tavern. Through the events of the story, this picture ends up being changed. The narrator mentions it in passing, but regardless of who's actually in that picture, the people of that town live their lives pretty much the same way. It doesn't matter who's in charge. Trade a king for a president. We're doing the same thing. Everything else is exactly the same, which harkens back to a question we asked ourselves previously about who the American Revolution was actually for. The second big idea here is something I want you to pay close attention to, and that's the setting of this story. Setting is the where and when of a narrative. It's the backdrop against which the events of the story play out. And I want you to pay particular attention to the when of this story. And it will become very apparent to you as you read this story why that's a key detail to look for. Does this story contain a moral warning for the reader? If so, what is the takeaway? Often legends, fairy tales, and folklore will contain a sort of message or moral for the reader to discover. And if this story falls into one of those genres, I want you to try to figure out what that message might be. What is the warning that the text of Rip Van Winkle gives to the reader? And lastly, I want you to enjoy this story. We've spent several weeks slogging through some difficult texts full of some really challenging ideas. Now we get to read something that is a little more fun. So I want you to try to actually enjoy reading this story with its twist and turn of a plot. And of course, we'll get together and talk about that very soon. That's going to do it for this video, guys. Until next time, good luck, have fun, what a time to be alive.